My name is Sela Whitmore, and I died on December 12, 2024. I know this may sound dramatic or impossible, but there is no other way to say it. My heart stopped. My body was declared lifeless, and my soul was taken to a place no human being can imagine without experiencing it. What I witnessed changed everything: my belief, my perception of reality, and mainly, the mission that I started to carry within me. As much as I would like to start this story softly, there is no way to sugarcoat the truth. I was an ordinary woman, or at least I thought I was. I built my career with years of effort and dedication, becoming CEO of one of the largest technology companies in Chicago. My work was my life. All that mattered to me was the next deal, the next acquisition, the next opportunity to expand my empire. I grew up hearing that success was measured in numbers, and I followed that logic to the letter. She had a husband, a luxurious house, influence. What more could I want? The answer came in subtle ways over the years. Small doubts that arose in the middle of the night, a deep discomfort when I saw news of suffering, an empty feeling in moments when I should be happy. I ignored all of this. I told myself that I was tired, that I needed a vacation, that this was just the way life was. My husband, Elliot, shared the same mindset. A renowned lawyer, always busy, always logical. For him, anything that fell outside our rational circle of understanding was disposable. I never needed to express my doubts to know he wouldn't believe them. My faith? One detail. Something I held as tradition, not as truth. I went to church on Sundays, made generous donations to charitable projects, participated in Christian events when necessary, but I had never given myself to that faith as something real. God was a distant idea, something people mentioned to make themselves feel better, but that didn't really affect their everyday lives. I believed I was in control of my life, that my plans were unbreakable, but I was wrong. And on December 12, 2024, my world fell apart. December 12th started like any other. Winter in Chicago had already taken over the city, leaving the air sharp and the streets covered in a white blanket of snow. I left the house early, wearing my expensive overcoat and leather boots, not imagining that this would be the last time I would step outside the house as the woman I was. The surgery I would have was simple: gallbladder removal, nothing serious. My doctors assured me it would be a quick and safe procedure with no complications. My husband, Elliot, was supposed to accompany me, but, as always, a last-minute meeting at the firm required his presence. "It's just routine surgery, Sela," he said, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. "You'll be fine. I'll stop by the hospital later." I agreed, without paying any attention. I didn't see the need for fuss myself. I took a taxi and headed to the hospital alone, checking emails on the way. When I arrived, the medical team was already prepared. Dr. Rebecca Langford, chief surgeon, came to me and calmly reviewed the details of the procedure. "You'll be under general anesthesia, but it will be quick, an hour at most." "Great," I replied, without paying much attention. My thoughts were elsewhere. I would miss an important meeting with investors that morning. Before entering the operating room, I sent some instructions to my assistant, closed the phone and took a deep breath. I trusted science. Everything was under control. I lay down on the operating table and looked around. The environment was cold, lit by fluorescent lamps. Equipment monitored my vital signs. The anesthesiologist approached. "Let's start the countdown." 10, 9, 8. And then, the world went dark. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, my consciousness was ripped from the darkness. But something was different. I was looking down, seeing my own body limp on the operating table. My heart stopped. The monitors started screaming. I saw the doctors in panic. Dr. Langford was shouting orders to the team, trying to reverse the situation. But I wasn't afraid. Something inside me knew that death had come, but not as I imagined it would be. I felt a presence. Something invisible began to pull me up, and that was when everything changed. I floated above the operating table, completely aware of what was happening. Down below, I saw the doctors running, their faces tense and hurried. Dr. Langford was pressing on my chest, trying to revive my heart. "Charge to 200 now!" someone shouted. A crack filled the room, the shock of the defibrillator shaking my limp body. But I didn't feel anything. I was outside, watching. My first thought was confusion. How was that possible? I was there, but I wasn't there either. I could see every detail clearly, even hear the doctor's thoughts. This doesn't make sense, I thought, trying to process the situation. But soon a strange peace came over me, a feeling of fulfillment I had never experienced before. There was no more rush, anxiety, or worry, just existence. And then I felt something. It wasn't a physical touch, but a force, an irresistible pull pulling me upward, like a magnet that pulled my soul, taking me away from that sterile and noisy environment. First came darkness, but not frightening darkness. It was a silent void, a space where time didn't seem to matter. And then, there he was, the tunnel of light. It was something alive, pulsating. It wasn't just light. It was warmth, love, a presence that filled everything around me. I didn't walk. I was carried away, absorbed by that indescribable energy. Everything that worried me before, business, meetings, status, disappeared like dust in the wind. Nothing else mattered, just that light. Inside the tunnel, impossible colors danced around me. There were sounds, but they weren't noisy. It was a pure melody, something that echoed inside me like a forgotten memory, as if, somehow, I had been there before. My mind couldn't understand, but my spirit knew. I was going home. There was no fear. There was no pain. Just the certainty that I was being led to something greater than anything I had known on Earth. And then, the tunnel opened. What I saw beyond him changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and eternity. As soon as I exited the tunnel, I was enveloped by a reality that no human words could fully describe. The light didn't just come from a specific point, she was it all. It penetrated every fiber of my being. I didn't see a sun or a light source, because that light was life, era presence, era absolute love. The ground beneath my feet was not made of stone or earth, but of something ethereal and vibrant, as if it were alive. I perceived colors that never existed in the physical world, shades that my earthly mind could never imagine. Then came the most overwhelming feeling of all. I wasn't alone. There was a presence, an infinite consciousness that filled everything around me. Before I even saw him, I knew who he was, Jesus Christ. Not because someone announced it, but because my soul recognized him instantly. It was like meeting someone who had always been with me, but who I had ignored my entire life. And then, I saw him. He was in front of me, incomprehensibly glorious, with a light that did not come from outside but from inside. His face was indescribable, not because it was impossible to see, but because it contained all: pure love, unwavering justice, infinite mercy, and deep pain. His eyes, oh, his eyes, they went through my soul, exposing every thought, every doubt, every moment of my existence. There was no need for words, but he spoke. His voice was no ordinary sound. It was a truth that echoed within me, vibrated in my essence, impossible to ignore. My daughter, my church is in danger. The sadness in his voice hit me like a blow to the chest. How could I be in such a glorious place and feel sadness at the same time? But then, I understood. He wasn't just welcoming me. He was me calling for something greater. What you see today will be difficult, but you need to remember every detail. You need to tell the world. Then, something started to change around us. The celestial light in the background began to dissolve, as if we were being taken to another space. I felt your touch on my hand, and suddenly, we were floating above the earth. What he would show me next would change not only my life, but the fate of thousands of people. The scenery before me began to transform. I was no longer in the heavenly realm. Now, it floated above something I recognized immediately, to Earth. But it wasn't Earth as I knew it. I saw everything from above, as if I were looking at a map. But this map did not show political or geographic boundaries. Instead, the surface was covered in points of light. Some glowed brightly, others were dim, flickering like candles about to go out. And then there were those that seemed distorted, shrouded in strange shadows. Look carefully. Jesus' voice was firm, and as he spoke, I was pulled closer to one of those spots. Suddenly, I was no longer watching from above. I was inside. I found myself in front of a monumental church, an immense building with gigantic screens and a parking lot full of luxury cars. The building looked more like a convention center than a place of worship. The doors opened, and I was taken inside. What I saw there made my heart sink. The pulpit was not a simple altar. It was a stage, with lighting worthy of a rock concert. The audience was mesmerized by the man at center stage, a preacher dressed in an expensive Italian suit, his gestures calculated and his tone engaging. "Give God your best," he cried, and the crowd responded in chorus. "The bigger your seed, the bigger your harvest." The Spirit of God allowed me to see beyond the surface. Suddenly, people's faces began to change. Some were crying, holding credit cards, checks, money, throwing everything at the foot of the altar. Saw a single mother, his face full of hope and despair at the same time, handing over his last savings. An elderly man, pulling crumpled bills from his pocket with shaking hands. Then I saw something even more terrifying. Spiritual beings, shrouded in false light, circulated around the place. They whispered in the ears of the faithful, planting words that seemed like messages of encouragement but were actually invisible chains tied to their hearts. Jesus held my hand firmly. "They teach my people to serve money in my name." I felt a crushing weight. Those people, they believed they were doing the right thing, but they were being deceived. The preacher on the stage smiled as the coffers filled. He didn't see the shadows around him, but I saw it. Jesus took me behind the stage, into a luxurious office. I saw the preacher counting piles of money, making secret deals, living a life of opulence while his flock suffered. "My house should be a place of prayer," Jesus said sadly. But look what they did to her. The weight of those words was unbearable. I wanted to scream. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to do something, but I couldn't. Then everything started to change again. The world around us dissolved, and I realized that this was just the first of 4 visions, and I feared what would come next. The first vision had been devastating, but I knew it wasn't over. Jesus' presence at my side was comforting, but it also carried a weight of urgency. Before I could even process what I had just witnessed, the scenery around us began to transform again. It was as if we were being pulled to another part of the spiritual world, to another place where the truth was being corrupted. Suddenly, I was in a large auditorium. The environment was modern, lit with colorful lights that moved across the ceiling. The sound of a band played in the background, not a worship song like the ones I knew, but something different, something designed to entertain. The public applauded, smiled, drank coffee from disposable cups. I looked around, confused. Was it really a church? There were no crosses visible, no mention of God on the walls or on the screens that showed motivational phrases. What I saw on stage was a young and charismatic man, dressed casually in ripped jeans and a designer t-shirt. He smiled, gestured, told jokes. "Everyone is welcome here," he said, his voice full of enthusiasm. "The important thing is that you feel good about yourself." The audience laughed and applauded, completely involved, but I felt a tightness in my chest. Something was wrong. Jesus, at my side, instructed me with a simple command. "Listen." I focused on what the man was saying. He talked about happiness, about personal growth, about achieving your dreams. He mentioned God a few times, but something was missing. There was no mention of repentance and holiness or transformation. "Here, we don't judge anyone," the pastor continued. "We want you to leave here feeling better than when you entered." And then I understood. They were removing everything they could challenge people to change. They didn't talk about sin, because that could offend. They didn't talk about repentance, because that could alienate visitors. It was a message light, without commitment, without depth. Jesus sighed beside me, and when I looked at him, I saw the sadness in his eyes. "They are afraid to preach me." Those words hit me like a blow. I looked around and noticed something I hadn't noticed before. People were smiling, but their eyes were empty. It was as if they were being fed something that looked good but didn't sustain them. Suddenly, I was taken to an office inside that same church. A group of leaders were gathered around a table, discussing the upcoming sermon series. "We need something that attracts more young people. The beating yourself theme was a hit last month. We can follow that line. Just don't talk about the cross or blood or repentance. People have enough problems in their lives to deal with that." My heart sank. They were editing the gospel, cutting out essential parts to make it more palatable. They were transforming the message of the cross into a self-help product, something that would keep people coming back, but without ever leading them to true transformation. Then Jesus pointed to the roof of the building. When I looked up, I saw something horrible. A black fog hung over the building, blocking God's light. Inside that church, people thought they were free, but they were being fed empty words. They were spiritually malnourished. "They think they are serving me," Jesus said, "but they are just entertaining the crowds. They are afraid of losing limbs, of being rejected by the world. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny before the Father. My body shook upon hearing this. Those churches were not actively turning people away from God, but they were keeping them in a state of false security. Then, the scenario started to change again. I wanted to scream, I wanted to warn them, but I couldn't. I could only follow Jesus to next vision, and I feared it would be even worse. The environment around us dissolved, and, once again, I was sucked into another scenario. My heart felt heavy as each vision seemed more devastating than the last. What else could be happening to churches? What other form of deception was spreading? When I realized we were in front of another church, but this time there was something different, no air. The atmosphere was charged, almost oppressive. The building was imposing, and its facade boasted huge banners with the face of a man, the pastor of that congregation. His name was everywhere, in books, on walls, in the pulpit, on gigantic screens. Inside the temple, I saw something that made me shudder. The service hadn't started yet, but people were already in absolute euphoria. They held books and t-shirts with the pastor's photo. Some cried just when they saw him enter the building. Others touched the red carpet that he walked down the aisle, as if it carried some special power. I was taken backstage and I saw him there, the man who had become greater than his own message. He was surrounded by a team that adjusted his clothes, touched up his makeup, organized his speech. He looked like an artist about to enter the stage. And in a way, that was exactly it. When he finally took the pulpit, screams filled the room. People revered him in a way I had only seen at big celebrity shows. He smiled and opened his arms, taking in the adoration. "Today I have a powerful word for you," he proclaimed, and the crowd erupted in applause. I looked at Jesus beside me. His face was one of deep sadness. "They have forgotten me." The pastor started to preach, but something bothered me. He talked about faith, prosperity, success, but he never mentioned Jesus directly. When I did, it was always in connection with himself, as if he had a special revelation that no one else had. Then I realized the worst, that church was not worshiping God. I was worshiping a man. Jesus held my hand and led me closer. My vision intensified, and I could see beyond people's physical appearance. There was invisible strings tied to their bodies, like spiritual puppets. They did not seek the presence of God, but pastor's approval. Many did not make decisions without consulting him first. For them, he was the final voice, the ultimate authority, above even the scriptures. We were taken to the pastor's office. I saw security guards blocking worshipers who just wanted to talk to him. I saw envelopes stuffed with money being organized. I saw messages and contracts that involved profitable partnerships with politicians and business people, far beyond any ministerial work. Jesus pointed to a corner of the room, and there I saw something that chilled me to the bone. A bronze statue with the image of the shepherd. "They have erected an idol within my temple." My soul writhed when I saw that. The pastor himself believed he was special, chosen above others. His influence was absolute. If he said something was true, his faithful would never question it. He had become a mediator between the people and God, something that Christ had already abolished on the cross. Jesus spoke once again, with a voice full of pain. "When I died, the veil of the temple was torn. I opened the way for everyone to come to me directly. But look what they did. The weight of those words crushed me. They were rebuilding the veil. They were replacing a direct relationship with God with an absolute dependence on a human leader. Then I saw something even more terrible. I saw people who tried to question the pastor and were excluded, humiliated, even cursed in public. I saw families destroyed because someone dared to say that that man's word was not law. I saw people losing their faith because the man they trusted fell into scandals. Jesus showed me what happened spiritually when a pastor put himself above God. The church, which should be a place of liberation, became an invisible prison. The people, who should follow Christ, were following a mortal and flawed man. Jesus looked into my eyes and said firmly, "No man can take my glory. No leader can replace my spirit, but they keep trying." My heart was torn apart. I wanted to scream, run, warn them, but I could only watch. And then, everything started to change again. Jesus was taking me to the fourth and final vision. I didn't want to see, but I knew I needed it. The scenery around us dissolved once again. My heart was already heavy, my soul shaken by the previous revelations. But I knew there was more. The last vision. When everything stabilized again, I realized we were inside another church. But this was different. There was no air of luxury or ostentation like in the prosperity church. There was also no theatrics of churches that diluted the truth to entertain. Here, the environment felt modern, inclusive. The pulpit was replaced by a simple stage, with chairs arranged informally. A diverse group of people were gathered, some in relaxed clothes, others with more daring looks. Everything seemed accessible. At first, there didn't seem to be anything wrong. I saw young people talking, couples hugging, families looking at ease. But then Jesus instructed me again. Listen carefully. I turned to the stage, where a pastor was speaking. His voice was calm, full of softness. He didn't shout like the prosperity preacher, nor did he make jokes like the entertainment church leader. But as his words left his mouth, I felt a shiver run down my spine. God's love is greater than any outdated concept. The congregation nodded. We need to abandon this outdated view of sin. God loves us as we are. He accepts us without us having to change. I felt a cold spread through my body. Those words seemed beautiful, full of compassion, but they were poison. I was taken closer and began to hear the conversations among the faithful. Here, no one judges anyone. Finally, a place where I don't have to feel guilty about what I do. If God is love, then he demands nothing of me. And then I realized the truth had been removed. They spoke of love, but they did not speak of regret. They preached acceptance, but not transformation. Sin, from which Jesus came to free us, was now treated as something irrelevant, as if it had never been a problem. Jesus closed his eyes for a moment. His expression was of deep pain. See what happens when the truth is compromised. The scene changed. I saw young people growing up without any notion of right and wrong. I saw Christian leaders justifying behaviors that the Bible condemned. I saw churches rewriting the scriptures, removing passages that might offend, and then I saw something scary. A pastor on a TV show smiling at the camera saying, "The Bible is a book that needs to be interpreted according to modern times." As he spoke, the pages of scripture before him began to dissolve, as if they were being erased. My chest tightened. "They're not just twisting the truth," Jesus said. "They're erasing it." I saw families being divided, parents teaching their children that they could follow any path because God would accept them anyway. I saw churches stop talking about repentance because it might turn people off. I saw Christians losing their identity, no longer knowing what they really believed. Then Jesus showed me something even worse. I saw a young man who grew up in this church, listening to sermons about love and acceptance without the need for change. When he went through hardships, when the weight of life came upon him, he found no truth to sustain him. He abandoned faith because I had never understood its depth. They think they are saving souls by making faith more accessible, Jesus said. But in reality, they are turning them away from me. They are giving the people sweet words, but without power. They promise freedom, but they are chaining people to deception. My heart broke. Then Jesus pointed to the top of the building, and there, I saw something shocking. The roof of the church had disappeared. In its place, a deep darkness hung over them. I saw demons whispering beautiful words into the ears of leaders, encouraging them to continue on that path of concessions, of adaptation, of erasing the truth. Jesus held my hand. His voice was strong, definitive. Unless they repent, many of these places will become unrecognizable as my churches. They will not notice when my presence leaves. The words hit me like lightning. They still thought they were serving God, but he was no longer there. I felt a desperate urge to cry, to warn these people, to beg them to return to the truth before it was too late. But before I could say anything, the scenario began to change once again. The visions were over, but my mission was just beginning. Suddenly, everything around me began to dissolve. The weight of the visions was still upon me, and my soul felt crushed by all I had witnessed. My heart ached for those people, by those who had been deceived, for those who thought they were in the light, but were being consumed by darkness without realizing it. I still felt the presence of Jesus beside me. I wanted to ask so many things. How did this happen? How did they allow his truth to be distorted in this way? How could I, an ordinary woman, do anything in the face of such a huge mistake? Before I could formulate my questions, he spoke. His voice was firm, but filled with love and authority. "Now you understand what needs to be done." I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. His words weighed on me because I knew what they meant. I would have to go back. My spirit wanted to remain there in the light, in peace, but something inside me knew I still had a purpose on earth. I needed to carry this message forward. "But Lord, My voice broke, barely a whisper. They won't listen to me. They will call me crazy, a fanatic. The very leaders who should be guiding your people will silence me. He nodded slightly, as if he already knew exactly what would happen. Not everyone will believe it, Selah, but those who have ears to hear will hear. My soul writhed. I didn't want to go back, not after having felt the fullness of his presence, not after being bathed in a peace I had never known. But I knew, if he was asking me to return, then it was because there was still hope. It was then that Jesus did something that completely broke me. He held my hands and looked into my eyes. His gaze was so deep that it pierced my spirit. I need you to go. Many of mine are being deceived. Many are hungry for the truth but cannot find it. They need to know there is still time to return. A warmth began to envelop my body. I was being pulled back. Selah, tell them to go back to their first love. My tears fell uncontrollably. The first love, one that I had never truly experienced until that moment. Tell them to seek me, to leave distractions aside, to find their way back to me before it is too late. The light around me began to dissipate. My spirit was being ripped out of that wonderful place, pulled back into the physical world. I didn't want to go, but I knew there was no choice. The last thing I heard was his voice, like an echo deep inside me. I'll be back soon. And then, darkness swallowed me. It was a shock. My chest expanded violently as air filled my lungs again. My body was shaking. Something warm ran through my skin like electricity. And then I heard voices, screams. Oh my God, she's back. My eyes opened. Blurred white lights momentarily blinded me. Everything was blurry, confusing. I heard machines beeping, doctors running. I was alive, but I knew I would never be the same again. My mind was still trying to process everything when I felt the sharp pain shoot through my chest. It was as if my body was waking up from a long sleep, trying to remember what it was like to be alive. My hands were shaking, and I could barely breathe. I was back. The voices around me seemed distant at first, as if I were emerging from a deep ocean. Then they started to become clearer. She's back, I heard one of the doctors exclaim, his voice filled with astonishment and disbelief. I blinked, trying to focus my vision. I was in hospital recovery room, surrounded by doctors and nurses who looked at me as if I were a walking miracle. Dr. Langford stood right in front of me, her face pale and her eyes wide. She held a stethoscope with shaking hands, unable to hide the shock in her expression. That doesn't make sense, she murmured, still checking my vitals. His heart stopped for longer than should be possible for someone to come back without brain damage. But there was no damage. On the contrary, I had never felt so alive. And then it all hit me at once. The visions, the words of Jesus, the mission he gave me. My body was here, but my soul still carried the weight of everything I had witnessed. I need to talk. My voice was weak but firm. I looked at Dr. Langford, then at the other doctors. They wouldn't understand, but I had to try. I was dead, but I saw Jesus. The silence in the room was immediate. The looks of shock turned into something I expected, skepticism. Dr. Langford forced a tentative smile, trying to maintain her professional composure. Selah, you have experienced significant trauma. It is normal for the brain to create vivid sensations during cardiac arrest. I shook my head. No, it wasn't a hallucination. I was with him, and he showed me things that are happening to the churches. She exchanged a quick glance with one of the doctors next to her, and at that moment I knew that they didn't believe me. But I didn't care. My mind was already somewhere else. I needed to get out of there. I needed to warn people. My heartbeat was strong. My lungs worked perfectly. Against all medical odds, I was fine, and I knew this wasn't a mistake. I was brought back for a reason. My hands tightened on the bedsheet, and my voice came out stronger than before. I need to talk to the world. The following days were a whirlwind. My body was healed, but my mind and soul carried an immeasurable weight. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the visions came back like a shock. The churches, the deceived people, the words of Jesus echoing inside me like thunder. The medical team was still trying to understand how I had come back without any after effects. I passed by examinations, neurological tests, psychiatric evaluations, but I knew the truth. I didn't go back because science saved me. I came back because Jesus sent me back. Elliot, my husband, arrived at the hospital the next day. I had already expected his disbelief, but seeing it on his face still hurt. Selah, this can't be real. He held my hand, his expression mixing relief and concern. I was dead, Elliot. My voice was firm. I saw Jesus. I saw what's happening to the churches. He let out a long sigh, rubbing his face. Selah, you've been through trauma. You've been starved of oxygen. The brain creates images when you're close to death. It wasn't a hallucination. He looked at me as if he were dealing with a child. Selah, I love you, but do you really believe that God sent you back on a mission? Do you believe that the churches are in danger and that you were chosen to warn them? I took a deep breath. Try. Silence fell between us like an abyss. Elliot was a practical man, a lawyer accustomed to facts, evidence, but there in front of him, I had nothing to offer other than the truth that burned inside me. He stepped back a little, as if he were seeing a stranger before him. Selah, think carefully before you go through with this. If you start saying that you saw Jesus, that you had visions, people will ridicule you. You could lose everything. He was trying to protect me, but he didn't understand. Elliot. My voice was softer now. I've already lost everything. When I died, I realized that nothing I thought was important really mattered. Nothing. But what I saw, what he told me, that matters. His eyes filled with frustration. Selah, you can move on with your life. You can continue your work, recover, and forget about this. I shook my head. I can't. He sent me back for a reason. I have to talk. Elliot was silent for a long moment. Then he got up and grabbed his coat. If you're really going to do this, I can't support you. I can't be married to someone who's going to ruin his own life with these stories. My heart sank. Are you giving me an ultimatum? He didn't respond immediately. He just looked at me like I was making the worst mistake of my life. I won't wait to watch you destroy yourself. And then, he left. The weight of the moment crushed me. Losing my marriage, my stability, my reputation. I knew it was just the beginning. But what could I do? I couldn't remain silent. I looked up at the white ceiling of the hospital and murmured, Lord, help me. And at that moment, a certainty filled my heart. I wasn't alone. I was released from the hospital a few days later, but it seemed like an eternity had passed since I entered that surgical center for a simple operation. I had died and come back. And now, I was alone. Elliot didn't look for me. No calls, no messages. I knew he needed time to process, but deep down I felt like he wasn't coming back. My own home was no longer mine. The once luxurious environment now seemed empty, suffocating. My eyes roamed every detail of the mansion, realizing how I had lived my entire life surrounded by excess but empty inside. I was determined to begin my mission. But how? I started trying to share my testimony online. I made short videos and wrote detailed reports about what I had experienced. But the response was devastating. Another lunatic wanting attention. That's just post-traumatic delirium. If God really spoke to anyone, it would be a pastor, not a corrupt CEO. I was ridiculed by strangers and even by people I considered friends. Some said I was going through a mental breakdown. Others accused me of trying to gain fame. My company started to be questioned. My own partners called me in for an emergency meeting. Selah, you are ruining your credibility, said one of the directors. You are exposing us to ridicule, said another. What hurt me most was seeing the fear in their eyes. Not afraid for me, but afraid of losing money, losing investors. They didn't care about my experience. They wanted me shut me up. And then came the final blow. I was removed from my own company. They announced in a formal statement that due to the emotional stress I was experiencing, I would need an indefinite leave. In other words, I was out. My world was falling apart. I had lost everything. My marriage, my reputation, my career, all for telling the truth. I went home that night and knelt on the cold living room floor. I was shaking. The tears finally fell uncontrollably. Lord, I tried. I did what I could, but no one believes me. They rejected me. What else can I do? The silence was overwhelming. It was then that my phone vibrated. In the midst of so many messages of hate and ridicule, there was a different one. I saw your video. I know you're telling the truth. I also had an experience with Jesus, but my church kicked me out for speaking out. Can you help me? My fingers froze on the screen. I read and reread that message. Someone had heard, and in that moment, I understood. I didn't need the whole world to believe in me. I needed to find those who were already feeling something was wrong. If there was one person, there was others. I got up from the floor, wiped my tears and murmured, "Sir, I will continue." And from that moment, my mission truly began. In the following days, something unexpected began to happen. Even with all the hate, mockery, and rejection I faced, messages like that first one started appearing more frequently. In the midst of the criticism and attacks, there were those who believed, "My mother gave everything she had to a prosperity church, and now she's in poverty. What you said opened my eyes. My church started removing passages from the Bible that talked about sin. Now I see why. I always felt something was wrong with modern Christianity, but I couldn't explain it. Your testimony gave me the courage to question it. It was as if an invisible chain was being broken. People were starting to wake up, and I realized that my mission was not to convince the blind, but strengthen those who were already starting to see. However, with that, they came new attacks. Pastors from famous churches began to publicly criticize me. "Brethren, do not be deceived by this woman. God does not speak to someone like her. The devil disguises himself as light. This is just an attempt to destroy faith. This story is false. If God wanted to reveal something so important, he would have used one of his chosen servants, not someone from the corporate world." I became one target. I was threatened. My videos were reported and removed. My name became a laughingstock among influential religious leaders. They tried to silence me, but what they didn't realize is that the more they talked about me, the more people started looking for what I had said. In the midst of the chaos, I met someone who would change everything. His name was Sister Miriam. She was an elderly woman with a calm voice who came to me after hearing my story. We met in a simple cafe, away from the spotlight. His gaze was deep, full of wisdom. "The Lord chose you for something difficult," she said, holding my hands. "But you're not alone." Tears filled my eyes. I needed to hear that. She took me to her church, a humble little hall, no big screens, no luxury, no marketing. There, Christians who had been rejected for speaking the truth gathered in prayer. "This is the true church," she said. "Christians who don't bow to the system, who don't sell the word. We don't have huge numbers, but we have the presence of God." When I entered that place, I felt something different, something that there was no point in the modern churches I have visited throughout my life. The presence of God, it was there. It was at that moment that I understood something that Jesus had shown me in one of the visions. The true church cannot be measured by the size of the buildings or the number of followers. The true church, I wasn't dying. She was hidden. But now, she was awakening. Over the next few months, my life took a turn I could never have imagined. My old existence, the luxuries, the influence, the position of power, no longer meant anything to me. What mattered now was carry the truth forward, awaken those who could still be awakened. My connection with Sister Miriam and her small community grew. I was introduced to other Christians who had been through the same thing as me. Rejected, silenced, called crazy for seeing what the majority refused to see. People who, like me, they knew something was terribly wrong with modern churches. And then, it happened. My message began to spread faster than they could control it. What started as short videos and scattered texts turned into a movement. People from various parts of the country began to share their testimonies, their experiences of oppression within corrupted churches, their doubts and questions that they never had the courage to express. Some lost friends, others lost their churches, many lost their families, but we were no longer alone. Then something scary happened to me. I started receiving messages from people within the very churches that Jesus had shown me in the visions. Leaders, assistant pastors, influential members who were awakening to the truth, but were afraid to speak. "Selah, what you said about prosperity theology is real. I work in church finance, and I know what goes on behind the scenes. But if I say anything, I'll lose my job and my family. My church has been removing Bible passages to avoid controversy. They say it's to attract more people, but that doesn't seem right. I have been a pastor for 20 years, and I realize that my own preaching has been tainted. I no longer talk about repentance. My heart is heavy. What do I do?" And then, the real war began. As the movement grew, the persecution intensified. Powerful churches began organizing to discredit everything I said. Religious leaders tried to defame me. My bank account has been blocked. My name was associated with conspiracies, sects, everything they could use to silence me. But they couldn't stop what was happening. Why it wasn't about me. Jesus was moving the pieces, and it was at that moment that I understood the last message he had given me before bringing me back. I'll be back soon. The true church was being separated from the false. The darkness was revealing itself. Time was running out. The remaining question was, who would still listen before it was too late? And I knew that was the mission I was sent back for. If you liked this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment on your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video and help us spread this message to a greater number of people. Until next time.